The sky bleeds crimson as lightning tears through the ancient forest. In the chaos, a female Homo habilis named Kara clutches her trembling infant to her chest, watching in horror as the world she knows burns to ash. The acrid smoke fills her lungs, but something else catches her eye, something that will change the course of human evolution forever. A strange, dancing light flickers between the charred trees, beautiful yet terrifying. She doesn't know it yet, but she's about to make the most dangerous discovery in human history. What happens when an innocent creature first encounters the power that will either save her species, or destroy it? Tonight, we witness the moment fire chose its first human master. The thunderstorm arrived like a vengeful god, transforming the peaceful twilight into a nightmare of sound and fury. Kara, a female Homo habilis with weathered hands and intelligent eyes, pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient baobab tree. Her infant son, barely 3 moons old, whimpered against her chest while the wind howled through the canopy above. "She, little one," she whispered, her primitive vocal cords struggling to form the guttural sounds that passed for comfort in her world. The sky anger will pass, but deep in her bones, she knew this storm was different. The air tasted of metal and death, and the lightning came too frequently, too violently. Each flash illuminated the terror in the eyes of her small family group, 7 adults and 3 younglings huddled beneath whatever shelter they could find. Brack, her mate, crouched nearby with their older son, Dunn. His massive frame trembled not from cold, but from a primal fear that even his limited understanding couldn't fully grasp. The other members of their clan, Grok, Nala, Old Zeph, and the others muttered prayers to spirits they couldn't name, their primitive minds overwhelmed by the fury above. Then it happened. A bolt of lightning, thick as a tree trunk and white as bone, struck the massive ironwood tree just 50 paces from their shelter. The crack was so loud it seemed to split the world in two. Kara's ears rang as the ancient giant, which had stood for perhaps 1,000 seasons, exploded into splinters and flame. But the fire didn't die with the tree. It spread. Hungry and alive, the flames leaped from branch to branch, consuming everything in their path. The drought had made the forest into kindling, and now the lightning had provided the spark for an inferno that would reshape their world. "Run!" Brack's voice was barely audible over the roar of wind and flame. "We must flee!" Kara struggled to her feet, her infant clutched tight. The smoke was already thick enough to choke on, and the heat pressed against her face like the breath of some enormous predator. Around them, other creatures were fleeing, antelope crashing through underbrush, birds shrieking overhead in frantic clouds, even the great tusked beasts trumpeting their terror as they thundered past. The clan stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the orange glow that grew brighter with each passing moment. Thorns tore at their flesh, roots caught their feet, and always behind them came the hungry roar of the flames. Little Dunn stumbled and fell. In the chaos, his cry was almost lost, but Kara heard it. She turned back, even as Brock shouted for her to keep running. "The boy!" she called, pointing through the smoke. Brack's eyes went wide with panic. He looked towards safety, then back at his fallen son, torn between protecting his mate and infant or saving his older child. The fire was so close now that individual trees were visible as they burst into flame. The choice was made for him when a burning branch crashed down between them, separating Kara from the rest of the clan. She found herself alone in a pocket of relative safety, holding her infant while somewhere in the smoke, she could hear Dunn crying for his mother. But something else caught her attention, something that made her primitive mind reel with confusion and wonder. At the base of the burning ironwood, where the lightning had first struck, the flames danced in patterns she had never seen before. They moved like living things, reaching upward with grasping fingers, consuming everything they touched but somehow controlled, contained, to a small area where the tree's trunk had split open. Kara had seen destruction before, floods that swept away everything, earthquakes that shattered stones, predators that killed without mercy. But this was different. This destruction seemed to have purpose, seemed almost intelligent. Her infant whimpered again, and the sound snapped her back to the immediate danger. The fire was spreading, and soon even this small pocket of safety would be consumed. She had to choose. Flee into the smoke-filled darkness where predators and worse things waited, or... Her eyes fixed on that strange, dancing light at the base of the ironwood. Something deep in her primitive brain whispered that this flickering mystery held power beyond her understanding. Power that might save them all or doom them forever. Kara's breath came in shallow gasps as she crept closer to the burning tree. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to follow the ancient wisdom that said fire meant death. But hunger for survival and a spark of curiosity that would one day define her species drove her forward. The flames at the tree's base were smaller now, contained within the hollow created by the lightning strike. They danced hypnotically, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move with their own malevolent intelligence. The heat radiating from them was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not the gentle warmth of sunlight, but something more primal and dangerous. Her infant son stirred against her chest, his tiny fist grasping at the smoky air. She looked down at his face, illuminated by the orange glow, and saw something that chilled her more than the storm ever could. His breathing was becoming labored, his tiny chest struggling with each inhalation of the toxic smoke. "No," she whispered, the sound lost in the crackling of flames and distant thunder. "Not you too." Panic flooded her system. Around them, the forest continued to burn, cutting off escape routes with each passing moment. In the distance, she could hear the clan calling her name, Brack's voice hoarse with desperation. Little Dunn crying for his mother. They were moving away, following the ancient law of survival that demanded the many be saved over the few. She was alone. Kara approached the mysterious fire, her primitive mind struggling to understand what she was seeing. The flames didn't behave like any natural phenomenon she knew, where water flowed downward and wind scattered in all directions. This moved upward with purpose, consuming the dead wood with an appetite that seemed almost conscious. A burning ember landed on her arm, and she jerked back with a sharp cry of pain. The tiny wound throbbed with a heat she had never felt before, but even as she nursed it, her eyes remained fixed on the flames. Then she noticed something extraordinary. A small branch had fallen near the fire's edge, and its tip had caught the strange dancing light. But instead of being consumed instantly, the branch held the flame like a gift. The fire traveled along the wood slowly, deliberately, as if it were choosing how fast to feed. With trembling hands, Kara reached for another fallen branch, this one further from the flame's reach. Her movements were careful, instinctive, guided by an intelligence that was just beginning to separate her species from the other creatures fleeing through the burning forest. She extended the branch toward the captive flames. The moment the dry wood made contact, something magical happened. The fire leaped across the gap like a living thing eager to spread. Now she held light and heat in her own hands, contained and controllable. But with that power came terror. The branch burned toward her fingers with steady inevitability. She nearly dropped it, nearly cast away the miracle she had stumbled upon. But her infant's labored breathing reminded her why she had risked this forbidden contact. Holding the burning branch high, she began to move through the smoke-filled forest. The fire pushed back the darkness, created a small sphere of visibility in the chaos. More importantly, it seemed to create a barrier the acrid smoke parted before it, giving her precious pockets of cleaner air. Her son's breathing eased. For the first time since the storm began, Kara felt something other than pure terror. This was power. This was control over forces that had always controlled her kind. But as she walked through the burning forest, branch held high like a primitive torch, she began to notice other things. Small creatures that had been fleeing now stopped to watch her pass. Their eyes reflected the firelight, But there was something more than curiosity in those gazes. There was fear. She was no longer just another animal fleeing the disaster. She was something new, something that commanded the very force that had sent all other creatures running in panic. The flame danced at the tip of her branch, and with each step, she understood more about the terrible responsibility she now carried. Behind her, a chorus of howls rose above the storm's dying thunder. The hyena clans had scented weakness in the chaos and were beginning their hunt. Injured and scattered creatures made easy prey, and the smell of smoke would mask their approach until it was too late. Kara quickened her pace, following the distant voices of her clan. But even as she ran, she could feel the eyes watching her from the shadows. Predators confused by this new sight prey that carried the skyfire, prey that had somehow tamed the untamable. The branch in her hand burned lower, closer to her fingers. Soon she would have to make another choice. Let the flame die and return to being helpless prey, or find a way to keep this miraculous power alive. In the distance, a hyena's laugh echoed through the smoke-filled trees, hungry and patient. The hyena pack found them at dawn. Kara had been walking for hours, following the faint trail left by her fleeing clan. Her burning branch had become a stub, the flames licking dangerously close to her fingers. Behind her, the forest still smoldered, sending columns of gray smoke into the pale morning sky. She had learned to feed the flame during her journey tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Dead twigs and dry leaves would accept the fire eagerly, allowing her to transfer it from one piece of fuel to another. But each transfer risked losing everything, and her primitive understanding of combustion was built entirely on desperate trial and error. Her infant son had survived the night, breathing easier in the cleaner air that somehow existed around the flame. She had named the fire Akel in her simple language meaning, bright spirit, and whispered to it like a living companion as she walked. Now, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange that matched her torch, she heard the sounds that made her blood freeze. The distinctive whoop of hunting hyenas growing closer. Kara pressed herself against a scorched tree trunk, trying to become invisible. Her torch flickered in the morning breeze, and for a terrifying moment she thought it might die. Without Akel, she would be defenseless, a lone female with an infant, perfect prey for the scavengers that followed in disaster's wake. Through the smoke-hazed trees, she saw them. 5 hyenas, their spotted coats gray with ash, moving in the coordinated pattern of experienced killers. Their leader, a massive female with scars across her muzzle, tested the air with her black nose. The creature's eyes locked onto Kara's position with the certainty of a predator that had found its next meal. But then something unprecedented happened. The lead hyena took a step toward Kara's hiding spot, then stopped. Her hackles rose, and she emitted a low whine of confusion. The other pack members gathered behind her, equally disturbed by something they couldn't identify. They could smell the prey female and infant, weak and alone. But there was something else. Something that triggered deep, ancestral fears coded into their predator minds. The smell of burning. The smell of the sky fire that had devastated the forest, that had sent every creature fleeing in panic. And somehow, impossibly, this smell was coming from their intended victim. Kara understood none of the complex emotions playing out in the hyena's primitive brains. All she knew was that they had stopped their advance. Slowly, carefully, she raised her torch higher. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The lead hyena jumped backward as if struck, her whine becoming a sound of pure terror. Fire meant pain, meant death, meant the end of everything they knew. No predator in their evolutionary history had ever encountered prey that commanded such power. For a long moment, predator and prey stared at each other across an invisible barrier created by flickering flame. Then, unbelievably, the hyenas began to retreat. Their coordinated hunt formation dissolved into chaos as each animal fought its own battle between hunger and fear. The scarred leader made one last attempt at aggression, taking 2 quick steps forward and snapping her jaws. But when Kara thrust the torch in her direction, the hyena let out a yelp of defeat and fled with the others. Kara stood alone in the morning light, torch held high, watching the most feared predators of her world disappear into the smoke. For the first time in her species' short history, fire had been used as a weapon, as protection, as a tool of survival. But the victory was short-lived. Her torch was nearly consumed, and she could see no suitable fuel nearby. The morning breeze, which had seemed gentle before, now threatened to extinguish the precious flame with each gust. Worse, she could hear new sounds in the distance, the trumpeting of angry elephants whose territory had been burned, the roar of lions displaced by the fire, the chittering of desperate primates competing for the few remaining sources of food and water. The fire had made her powerful, but it had also made her a target. Every creature that saw her flame would react with fear, confusion, or aggression. She was no longer part of the natural order. She had become something new, something dangerous, something alone. As she searched frantically for dry wood to feed a cow, her infant son began to cry. The sound carried far in the still morning air, announcing their location to any predator within miles. And in the distance, she heard an answering call. Brack's voice, hoarse and desperate. "Kara, where are you?" Her mate was looking for her, probably against the advice of the other clan members. But his calls would also attract every dangerous creature in the area. She had to choose. Call back and risk drawing predators to both of them, or remain silent and hope he found her before the torch died completely. The flame flickered lower, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her dilemma. In her hands, she held the power to transform her species' destiny. But first, she had to survive long enough to understand what that power truly meant. Brock found her at midday, following the thin trail of smoke that rose from her torch like a gray prayer to the sky. When he emerged from the burned underbrush, his eyes went wide with a mixture of relief and terror that Kara had never seen before. "You live," he said, his simple words heavy with emotion. But he stopped 10 paces away, staring at the flame she carried. What is this magic?" Kara felt her heart break at the fear in her mate's voice. She had imagined their reunion countless times during her night-long journey, how he would embrace her, how relief would wash away the terror of their separation. Instead, he crouched like a frightened animal, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. "A cow," she said softly, raising the torch slightly. "It protects us." The spotted hunters ran when they saw it. "The sky fire," Brock whispered, and she heard the awe and terror in those words. "You carry the sky fire." Their infant son chose that moment to reach toward the flame with tiny, curious fingers. Brack's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged forward, knocking the torch from Kara's hand in his desperation to protect his child. The burning branch fell to the ash-covered ground, and for a terrifying moment, Kara thought she had lost everything. But the flame caught on a pile of dry leaves, spreading quickly across the forest floor. "No!" she cried, dropping to her knees to gather burning material before it could escape completely. Her hands moved frantically, guided by hours of desperate experimentation. She managed to catch the fire on another branch, just as Brock stumbled backward in panic. "It spreads," he gasped. "The sky fire spreads like sickness." The fear in his voice cut deeper than any predator's claw. This was her mate, the father of her children, the one who had risked everything to find her. And now he looked at her like she was some dangerous stranger. "It can't be controlled," she insisted, demonstrating how she could make the flame smaller by removing fuel, larger by adding dry materials. "Watch it obeys." But Brock only shook his head, his primitive mind unable to process what he was seeing. Throughout their species' brief existence, fire had meant death and destruction. It was a force of nature like lightning or flood, something to be feared and fled from, never controlled. "The others," he said finally. They wait in the caves by the great water. Old Zeph says the sky spirits are angry. Says we have done something to bring their wrath. Kara's blood ran cold. Old Zeph was their shaman, the keeper of their spiritual beliefs. If he declared her cursed, the clan would abandon her without hesitation. "Take me to them," she said, standing with the torch held carefully away from her body. "Let me show them what I have learned." The journey to the clan's hiding place took most of the afternoon. They traveled in uncomfortable silence, Brock staying just far enough ahead to avoid the torch's heat while constantly looking back with worried glances. Every few minutes, he would mutter prayers under his breath, appeals to spirits and ancestors that Kara couldn't quite make out. When they finally reached the limestone caves overlooking the Great Lake, the reaction was immediate and devastating. Nala, the clan's other adult female, saw them approaching and let out a shriek of pure terror. "She brings the cursed fire. She brings death to us all." The clan scattered like startled birds. Men who had hunted alongside her for years grabbed their children and pressed themselves against the cave walls. Old Zeph emerged from the deepest chamber, his weathered face twisted with fear and anger. "Cast it away," he commanded, pointing one gnarled finger at her torch. The sky spirits demanded. "You have stolen their power, and they will punish us all." "No," Kara said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "This fire saved me. Saved us." The spotted hunters fled when they saw it, but her words only increased their terror. Grok, a young male who had always been friendly to her, picked up a stone as if preparing to drive her away by force. "The beasts fear it because it is evil," Zeph declared. "You have brought corruption into our midst. The spirits speak through me. You must choose. The fire or your family." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Kara looked around at the faces of her clan people she had known since childhood, who had shared food and shelter and protection. All she saw now was fear and rejection. Her infant son began to cry, sensing the tension. The sound echoed off the cave walls, and several clan members covered their ears as if his cries might summon more supernatural punishment. Only Little Dunn stepped forward, his young eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. "The fire is pretty," he said in his child's voice. "Can I touch it?" "No." Brock grabbed his son, pulling him back. "You will not corrupt the boy with your magic." Magic. The word hit Kara like a physical blow. She had discovered something that could protect them all, could drive away predators and light their way through darkness. But to her clan, it wasn't a tool or a discovery. It was something supernatural, something dangerous, something that marked her as other. The torch in her hand flickered lower, running out of fuel. Soon she would have to make a choice: let it die, and return to being just another member of the clan, or find a way to keep it alive despite their fears. But as she looked into their terrified faces, she realized the choice might not be hers to make. Old Zeph was gathering stones, and the others were following his lead. The stones came without warning. Old Zeph hurled the first one, a jagged piece of limestone that struck the ground near Kara's feet. The impact sent up a shower of sparks from her torch, causing several clan members to cry out in superstitious terror. "Cast out the fire carrier," the shaman commanded, his voice echoing off the cave walls, "before the sky spirits destroy us all." More stones followed. Kara clutched her infant to her chest and stumbled backward, desperately trying to protect both her child and the precious flame. A rock struck her shoulder, sending pain shooting down her arm, but she managed to keep the torch aloft. "Please," she begged, looking directly at Brock. "I am your mate, the mother of your children. Don't let them." But Brock had already picked up his own stone. His face was twisted with anguish, tears streaming down his ash-stained cheeks, but his primitive mind had made its choice. The clan's survival mattered more than any individual, even his beloved mate. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and threw. The stone struck her in the chest, knocking the wind from her lungs. She gasped, staggered, almost dropped the torch. Around her, the clan closed in like a pack of predators, their fear transformed into mob violence by Zeph's commands. Little Dunn broke free from his father's grasp and ran toward her. "Mama! Don't hurt Mama!" But Gra caught the boy before he could reach her, lifting him despite his struggles and cries. The sight of her older son being torn away gave Kara the strength she needed to run. She fled from the caves, torch held high, her infant's cries mixing with the angry shouts behind her. More stones flew through the air, several finding their mark. Pain blossomed across her back and arms, but she kept running, driven by a mother's desperation and something else, a growing realization that she could never return to what she had been. The clan pursued her for perhaps 100 paces before stopping at Zeph's command. "Let the wilderness take her," the old shaman called. "She has chosen the cursed fire over her people. Now she must face the consequences alone." Alone. The word echoed in Kara's mind as she stumbled through the burned forest. For the first time in her species' existence, one of their kind was truly solitary, cut off from the protection and cooperation that had allowed them to survive in a hostile world. Night was falling, and with it came the sounds that had always meant death for any isolated individual. The cough of hunting leopards, the whooping calls of hyena packs, the deep grunt of cave bears emerging from their dens. Without the clan's protection, without their shared vigilance and mutual defense, she was simply prey waiting to be taken. But she had something no lone human had ever possessed before: fire. As darkness deepened, Kara found a small clearing where she could see potential threats approaching from any direction. She gathered every piece of dry wood she could find, creating a pile that would feed her torch throughout the night. Her infant son nursed fitfully, disturbed by their traumatic day, but alive and warm in her arms. The first test came just after full dark. A pair of leopards appeared at the edge of the clearing, their spotted coats invisible except for the reflection of firelight in their eyes. They moved with the patient confidence of predators that had found easy prey, a lone female with an infant, exhausted and vulnerable. But as they crept closer, something unprecedented happened. The lead leopard stopped, confusion visible in its posture. The scent was right-injured human, helpless and isolated. But there was something wrong with the visual picture. The prey was surrounded by something that triggered deep, instinctive fear. Light where there should be darkness. Heat where there should be cold. The bright, dancing presence of something that meant forest fires and fleeing herds and death from the sky. Kara stood slowly, torch raised high. The flames cast wild shadows that made her appear larger, more threatening. When she took a step toward the leopards, they backed away with low growls of confusion. "A cow protects," she whispered to her infant son. "The fire spirits guard us." Throughout the long night, other predators tested her defenses. Each time, the result was the same. Creatures that should have torn her apart instead retreated in confusion and fear. The flame created an invisible barrier around her, a zone of safety in a world designed to kill the weak and isolated. But as dawn approached, Kara faced a terrible realization. Her fuel was running low, and her infant son was growing weaker. Without the clan's shared resources, their knowledge of safe water sources, their hunting cooperation, their collective protection, how long could they survive? Fire might protect them from predators, but it couldn't provide food or clean water or shelter from the elements. She had gained incredible power, but at a cost that might prove fatal. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the smoke-hazed sky, she heard something that made her heart stop. The distant sound of her clan breaking camp, preparing to move to new territory. In minutes, they would be gone forever, taking with them any hope of reconciliation or return. Her torch flickered lower, the flame dancing weakly at the tip of charred wood. Soon she would have to make yet another impossible choice. 3 moons had passed since the banishment, And Kara had become something her species had never seen before, a solitary survivor who thrived alone in the wilderness. She had learned to read the flame's moods, to understand its hungers and needs. Fire, she discovered, was like a living creature. It needed food, air, and careful tending. In return, it provided protection, warmth, and something even more precious, the power to cook meat. The discovery had come by accident. A small antelope, fleeing from some unseen predator, had stumbled into her fire and died. The smell of cooking flesh had drawn her hesitantly closer, and when she tasted the transformed meat, her primitive mind reeled with the implications. Cooked food was easier to digest, lasted longer before spoiling, and seemed to provide more strength than raw flesh. More importantly, the cooking process made previously inedible plants and roots safe to consume. Her diet had expanded dramatically, allowing her to survive in territories that couldn't support her clan's larger numbers. Her infant son had grown strong and healthy, his development accelerated by the superior nutrition. She had named him a Kelka, fire's gift, and already he showed none of the instinctive fear of flame that plagued other members of their species. But on this particular morning, as she tended her carefully maintained fire circle, she heard something that chilled her more than any predator's roar. The voices of her former clan carried on the wind. They were close, perhaps just beyond the ridge that bordered her territory. She could make out individual voices, Brack's deep tones, Little Dun's higher pitch, even old Zeph's raspy commands. They sounded desperate, frightened, and weak. Kara extinguished all but a small portion of her fire, concealing the telltale smoke that might reveal her location. Then, carrying a burning brand and her now walking son, she crept toward the sounds. What she found broke her heart. The clan was starving. Their clothing was in tatters, their faces gaunt with hunger. Several members bore fresh wounds from predator attacks, and she could see the telltale signs of sickness in their movements. Without her knowledge of fire-safe territories and cooked food preservation, they had struggled through the harsh season. Little Dun was worst of all. Her older son, now perhaps 4 seasons old, was painfully thin, his ribs visible through his sparse covering. He sat apart from the others, listlessly scratching patterns in the dirt with a stick. Brock knelt beside a small pile of raw roots, trying to divide them fairly among the clan members. But there wasn't enough food there, never was, anymore. Old Zeph muttered continuously about spirits and curses, his once authoritative voice reduced to the rambling of a broken mind. They were dying. All of them. Kara's first instinct was to run to them, to share her fire and her knowledge, to save her family despite their rejection. But Akelka tugged at her hand, his young face serious with an intelligence beyond his years. "That people?" he asked in their private language, a mixture of traditional sounds and new words they had developed together. "No," she whispered back. "Family, but afraid people." She watched for another hour, her heart breaking with each passing minute. The clan was making fatal mistakes, eating questionable plants, setting up camp in a location that would be indefensible against night predators, ignoring the signs of nearby water sources. They would not survive another month. But as she watched, a new sound made everyone freeze. The distinctive cough of a hunting leopard very close by. The clan members scrambled to their feet, grabbing their primitive weapons, but Kara could see the despair in their movements. They were too weak for a real fight, too scattered for effective defense. The leopard emerged from the underbrush with the casual confidence of a predator that had found easy prey. It was a massive male, scarred from countless hunts, utterly unafraid of the thin, desperate creatures before it. Without conscious thought, Kara stood and stepped into the clearing. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every head turned toward her, human and feline alike. She stood tall and strong, her clothes intact, her body healthy and powerful. Fire flickered at the tip of her brand, casting dancing shadows that seemed to make her larger than life. Kara! Dun's cry was pure joy, but it was quickly overwhelmed by gasps of fear and recognition from the adults. The leopard, however, reacted exactly as she had hoped. The sight of fire sent it backing away with a confused snarl. This was wrong, unnatural, dangerous. Prey did not carry the sky fire. Prey did not stand confident and unafraid. "Oh," she said quietly, and thrust the torch toward the great cat. The leopard fled. For a long moment, the clearing was silent except for the crackling of flame and the distant sound of the retreating predator. Then little Dun broke free from the group and ran to her, throwing his thin arms around her waist. "Mama came back," he sobbed. "Mama came back." Old Zeph stepped forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "The cursed fire," he whispered. "You still carry it." "Yes," Kara said simply. "And it has kept us alive." She looked around the circle of gaunt faces, her former clan members, her family, the people who had cast her out in fear. They were dying without the knowledge she had gained, the skills she had developed, the power she had learned to control. "I can teach you," she said quietly, "if you are willing to learn." Brock stepped forward, his face haggard but hopeful. "The fire? It can feed us? Protect us?" Kara nodded, then knelt and began to build a proper fire circle with stones and tinder. Akelka helped her, his small hands confident with tasks that would have terrified adults just a few moons before. "Fire is not a curse," she said as the flames caught and spread. "It is a gift, the greatest gift our kind will ever receive." As the warmth spread through the circle and the clan members crept closer despite their fears, Kara began to teach them how to feed the flames safely, how to cook meat and roots, how to use burning brands to drive away predators. She had become the first keeper of humanity's greatest discovery, the bridge between what they had been and what they would become. In her hands, fire was no longer the destroyer that had scattered them in terror. It was the tool that would transform them from prey into the masters of their world. The flame danced higher, casting light into the growing darkness, and for the first time since that terrible storm, the clan was truly safe. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the sky, but this time they did not flee in terror. They had learned to capture lightning's gift, to make it their own. The age of fire had begun,